The new feature film, Kill the Messenger, opens around the country this week.
To talk more about Gary Webb, we're joined by Robert Perry, investigative journalist who worked for years as an investigative reporter for both the Associated Press and Newsweek magazine. Reporting led to the exposure of what's now known as the Iran-Contra scandal. He edits the website consortiumnews.com. Robert Perry, welcome back to Democracy Now! Talk about the significance of Gary Webb, his life, his investigative journalism, Dark Alliance, and his ultimate suicide.
Well, history owes a great deal to Gary Webb. If it weren't for Gary and his courage in reviving this story in 1996, we would not have known anything near like the full picture of what happened in the 1980s. Some of us that were reporting it back then, myself and my colleague Brian Barger at the Associated Press, wrote the first story in December of '85, and that sparked Senator John Kerry to do a fairly good investigation that reported more about this by 1989. But because the major news organizations back then did not want to pursue this very difficult and painful story, they tended to dismiss it back then as well. It was up to Gary Webb in reviving the story in 1996 that forced the CIA to finally take seriously this investigation. And the Inspector General, Frederick Hitz, did a fairly thorough job, produced a report that amounted to an institutional confession by the Central Intelligence Agency that indeed they were aware of the Contra drug trafficking as far back as 1981, that it had continued throughout the decade, and that the CIA had consistently protected those drug traffickers, even to the point of steering away investigations by the Drug Enforcement Administration and the Justice Department, as well as Congress. So you had the CIA finally coming to the table and admitting that what we reported in the 80s and what Webb reported in the 90s was in fact true. The tragedy was that the mainstream news organizations that had dismissed the story in the 80s would not face up to this reality when it was even admitted to by the Central Intelligence Agency. We saw a complete failure, perhaps one of the most shameful examples of how the mainstream press can operate in destroying a fellow journalist for getting at an important story. And Webb suffered mightily for this. There's a special pain when your colleagues in your profession turn on you, especially when you've done something that they should admire and should understand. It's hard to do these kinds of stories. They're very difficult because of the reporting that's required, the going into the field, dealing with often unsavory characters, dealing with secret government sources. And to do all that work and then have the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Los Angeles Times attack you and try to destroy your life, there's a special pain in that. You
know, following the controversy around Dark Alliance, the San Jose Mercury News transferred Gary Webb from the paper's Sacramento office to a suburban office in Cupertino. In December '97, Webb resigned. I got a chance to speak to him on Democracy Now! About his resignation.
Hi, Amy. How you doing?
Good. Well, the more important question is, how are you doing?
Hey, I'm alive. I'm here, you know,
well,
and not working for that newspaper anymore, thank God.
Well, tell us exactly what happened.
Well, what happened was, you know, like you said, they transferred me out to the Boondocks, and I went on a byline strike, and I wouldn't allow my name to be used on any stories while I was out there, and you know, that made everybody even madder. And then I finally had to sit down and figure out, you know, this year and a half now since the series came out, and you know, what am I doing with my life, and what am I doing with my work that's meaningful? And I had to answer that, you know, nothing was happening. You know, it was clear to me that the Mercury, I mean, they had told me that, you know, even when we won the arbitration, they weren't going to let me do anything worthwhile, and were not going to let me do any investigative reporting. So I had to figure, you know, this is kind of pointless to hang around and work for a newspaper whose, you know, editors you didn't respect, and do dog bite stories for the rest of my life. It just didn't seem worthwhile.
That was Gary Webb speaking on Democracy Now! In December 1997. He would ultimately commit suicide. You can go to our website to see all of our interviews with Gary at democracynow.org. Bob Perry, your final comments about the significance of the story that he broke.
Well, there's no question that this is one of the most important stories of the 1980s and really the 1990s when you get to the end of this and the CIA confessing. But it's also a story about the failure of the mainstream press that extends to the present, goes through the Iraq War, the failure to be skeptical there, and goes right on to the present day. So it's not an old story. It's very much a current story.
Robert Parry, thank you so much for being with us. Veteran investigative journalist. Again, our website with Gary Webb at democracynow.org.